The salty tang of the Atlantic Ocean hung in the air that crisp Monday afternoon in Charleston. It was the kind of day that carried a quiet energy, the city shaking off the weekend slumber and gearing up for the week ahead. Inside my quaint Charleston home, however, a different kind of energy crackled, frustrating and unpredictable. It was a typical Monday in Charleston, and the air felt heavy with the salty tang of the Atlantic Ocean. The city was just waking up after a weekend of rest, getting ready for the week ahead. But inside my little Charleston home, something else was happening. For weeks, the lights had been flickering on and off at random, and it was driving me crazy. I finally decided to call in reinforcements. My neighbor, Mrs. Harwood, who knows everything and has a lot of charm, had recommended a local electrician. His name was Caleb H.K., and he was supposed to be the best in town. My neighbor, Mrs. Harwood, had recommended him. She said he was the best and he had this charming southern accent. I didn't know that this simple thing I did, seeking help, would make me so excited. I never thought that the doorbell would ring and I would open the door. I was expecting a seasoned electrical expert, someone who had been through a lot. Years of experience with callous hands and a knowing glint in their eyes, right? Instead, I was met with the sight of Caleb, a man who seemed more likely to grace the cover of a sports magazine than to troubleshoot faulty wiring. Tall and athletic with broad shoulders that filled out his work shirt, Caleb exuded an unexpected vitality. His sun-kissed skin hinted at days spent outdoors, and his dark eyes sparkled with a playful energy that instantly disarmed me. "Hi, I'm Caleb," he announced with a broad, genuine smile lighting up his face. His deep baritone with a hint of a southern drawl resonated with a quiet confidence that filled the small entryway. It was the kind of voice that promised solutions, that whispered assurances, that made you. His skin was a sun-kissed glow, hinting at days spent outdoors, and his dark eyes sparkled with a playful energy that instantly disarmed me. "I'm Caleb," he said, a broad, genuine smile lighting up his face. His deep baritone voice resonated with a quiet confidence that filled the small entryway. It was the kind of voice that promised solutions, that whispered assurances, that made you. His skin felt like kisses, like he'd spent days outside. His dark eyes had this playful sparkle that immediately made me feel at ease. "Hi, I'm Caleb," he said, smiling broadly. His voice was this deep baritone kind of southern drawl that had a quiet confidence. It was the kind of voice that made you believe in solutions, that whispered assurances that made you feel like everything was going to be all right. I felt this nervous flutter in my chest, trying not to show it. "Thanks for coming," I said. "These lights have been driving me crazy." I led him through the narrow hallway, the old wood and polish smells filling my senses. We went into the living room where the light fixture was flickering like a mischievous imp. "Hey, I'm Caleb," he said. I felt a nervous flutter in my chest and I knew I wasn't acting normally. I was grateful that he came and I told him the lights were driving me crazy. We went into the living room where the bad light was hanging. I felt a wave of self-consciousness wash over me as I gestured towards the ceiling. It just wouldn't cooperate. I explained that my voice was sometimes a bit shaky. Sometimes it goes completely dark and I'm totally lost. It's been unsettling. Caleb tilted his head, his gaze focused on the troublesome light with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Don't worry," he said, his tone a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. "We'll get to the bottom of this." I felt a sense of awareness wash over me as I gestured towards the ceiling. "It's really not working with me," I explained, my voice catching a little. "Sometimes it goes completely dark and I'm totally lost." "It's been a bit unsettling," Caleb said, tilting his head. His gaze was fixed on the troublesome light, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Don't worry," he said, his tone a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. "We'll get to the bottom of this with practiced ease." He set down his toolbox, revealing an array of meticulously organized tools: gleaming screwdrivers, pliers, a multimeter, and a powerful flashlight. Each item seemed to have its designated place, a testament to Caleb's professionalism and attention to detail. I found myself captivated by his every move as he climbed the small stepladder I had provided. His movements were fluid and efficient, each action deliberate and precise, like Caleb was a natural. He set down his toolbox and revealed an array of meticulously organized tools, including screwdrivers, pliers, a multimeter, and a powerful flashlight. Each item had its place, a testament to Caleb's professionalism and attention to detail. I was captivated by his every move as he climbed the small stepladder. His movements were fluid and efficient, each action deliberate and precise, like a well-rehearsed dance. The muscles in his arms flexed as he reached upwards, and I couldn't help but admire the strength and grace he displayed. "It's probably just a loose wire," Caleb muttered to himself, mostly to himself as he examined the flickering light. His brow furrowed in concentration, and his hands moved with practiced precision, tightening screws and checking connections as he worked. He explained what he was doing in a way that even I could understand. He had the moves down pat. Caleb was working on a loose wire and he broke the light down for me. He was in his element, explaining what he was doing in a way that even I could understand. He was calm and collected, and his voice had this undercurrent of focus. I couldn't help but be impressed by the depth of his knowledge and skill. He said, I used to have the same problem at my place. I got tired of calling someone every time it happened, so I figured I'd learn to do it myself." I laughed lightly, feeling more at ease with his easygoing demeanor. He continued, "I got this loose wire and I'm breaking it down for you. I'll show you how to tighten the screws and check the connections. I'll break it down for you step by step, and I'll explain the technical details with a calm and steady tone. I'll do it in a way that's easy for you to understand." He spoke calmly and clearly, and I could tell he was a true expert. He had this grin, and I couldn't help but be impressed by how much he knew and how well he did what he did. He said, I used to have the same problem at my place. I got tired of calling someone every time it happened, so I figured I'd learn to do it myself." I laughed lightly, feeling more at ease with his easygoing nature. "I wish I could do that every time. I try to fix something electrical and I end up making it worse. I don't think I have the talent for it." Caleb chuckled. The sound warm and inviting. "Don't worry, everyone's got their strengths. I'm pretty good with tools, but I can't cook to save my life. Burned toast is about as far as I go." His smile was infectious, and for a moment the persistent light issue felt like just an excuse for a pleasant conversation. "Nature, I wish I could do that. Every time I try to fix something electrical, I end up making it worse. I don't think I have the talent for it." Caleb chuckled. The sound was warm and inviting. "Don't worry, everyone's got their strengths. I'm pretty good with tools, but I can't cook to save my life. Burnt toast is about as far as I go." His smile was infectious, and for a moment the persistent light issue felt like just an excuse for a pleasant conversation. We continued chatting as he worked, and I learned more about him. Caleb had started his own electrical business a few years ago after training under a mentor who'd been an electrician for decades. His passion for his work was evident in every precise movement, every detail he meticulously attended to. Yet despite his expertise, there was a humility about him that I found unexpectedly endearing. As he spoke, I couldn't help but admire him. We kept chatting while he worked, and I learned more about him. Caleb had started his own electrical business a few years ago after training under a mentor who'd been an electrician for decades. His passion for his work was clear in every precise movement and every detail he meticulously attended to. Yet despite his expertise, there was a humility about him that I found unexpectedly endearing. I couldn't help but admire the way he seemed completely at ease in the chaos of wires and circuits. His strong hands moved deftly yet gently, as if he respected the delicate balance of power they held. His focus was razor sharp, and his brow creased slightly as he made sure each wire was perfectly in place. There was something almost calming about watching him work. It was like observing an artist paint a masterpiece, each stroke deliberate and precise. Then I realized I felt pretty embarrassed, so I looked away. I tried to make conversation to cover my awkwardness. "What do you do when you're not saving people from their electrical nightmares?" Caleb glanced down from his perch on the ladder, amusement sparkling in his dark eyes. "Well, when I'm not working, I like to watch movies. Action films are my favorite. Something about all the explosions and excitement. I guess explosions, huh?" He teased. "Relaxing." I looked away embarrassed. I was trying to make conversation to cover my awkwardness. "So, what do you do when you're not saving people from their electrical nightmares?" Caleb glanced down from his perch on the ladder, amusement sparkling in his dark eyes. "Well, when I'm not working, I like to watch movies. Action films are my favorite. Something about all the explosions and excitement, I guess. Explosions, huh?" I teased. "Relaxing." "Again, you're not getting enough of that excitement here." He laughed and I joined him. The sound filled the room with an easy sense of comfort as the conversation flowed. I found myself genuinely enjoying his company. The initial tension of having a stranger in my home melted away. The air in the room crackled with an unexpected energy, a warmth that had little to do with the faulty wiring Caleb was expertly mending. It was like an invisible thread had woven itself between us, creating an intimacy that defied the short time we'd spent together. That I found myself genuinely enjoying his company. The initial tension of having a stranger in my home melted away. The air crackled with an unexpected energy, a warmth that had little to do with the faulty wiring Caleb was expertly mending. It was as if an invisible thread had woven itself between us, creating an intimacy that defied the short time we'd spent together. Laughter bubbled up from within me, surprising in its spontaneity, a testament to the easy connection blossoming in the confines of my small apartment. Drawn in by an inexplicable force, I reached out and gently touched his arm. My fingers grazed the rough cotton of his work shirt. "You're incredibly skilled," I murmured, admiring the way. His hands were really good at untangling the wires. I could feel the heat from his skin, and for a second it felt like time stood still. Caleb stopped moving and his eyes met mine. I could see that he was surprised, and I felt my pulse race. We shared a silent look and I felt a spark of recognition. It made me smile, and I could see that Caleb was surprised by the contact. Caleb's hands moved quickly and expertly through the mess of wires. His skin was hot to the touch and I could feel my body responding to the heat. For a second it felt like time stood still. Then Caleb looked at me and our eyes met. There was a silent exchange of recognition and it made my pulse race. He smiled shyly and I could tell he was surprised by the contact. The air was filled with unspoken possibilities. "Thanks," he said. His voice was low and rumbling and it made me nervous. After clearing his throat, he focused again on the task at hand. But his movements still had a bit of tension in them and the atmosphere felt different. I took my hand back and I felt a blush creeping up my neck. I felt embarrassed and excited all at once. Caleb finished the repairs quickly and efficiently. The air vibrated with unspoken possibilities. "Thanks," he replied. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through me. He returned his focus to the task at hand, but a subtle tension lingered in his movements. A palpable shift in the atmosphere. I withdrew my hand, a blush creeping up my neck. A strange mix of embarrassment and exhilaration swirled within me. Caleb completed the repairs with an efficiency born of experience. With a final flick of the switch, the previous lifeless bulb sprang to life, casting a warm glow over the room and erasing the shadows of the day. "There you go," he announced, stepping down from the ladder with a grace that belied his sturdy frame. "Just a loose connection," he added, as I suspected. "Should be good to go now." Relief washed over me, not just for the restored light, but for the unexpected joy this encounter had brought. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you. I really appreciate your help. I truly appreciate your help." His smile, the same one that had disarmed me earlier, reappeared, radiating warmth and reassurance. "If you have any more electrical gremlins, you know who to call." As he packed his tools and headed towards the door, a wave of disappointment washed over me. His presence, his quiet strength, and the way he had effortlessly illuminated my day left me yearning for. I said, "Thank you so much. I really appreciate your help." His smile came back, the same one that had won me over earlier, full of warmth and confidence. "If you have any more electrical problems, you know who to call." As he packed his tools and headed for the door, I felt disappointed. His presence, his quiet strength, and the way he had brightened my day left me wanting more. But in that moment, like the fading sunlight, he stepped out into the twilight. His silhouette stretched long and lean against the deepening hues of the Charleston evening. Later, as the city lights twinkled against the darkening sky, I found myself drawn to the window. My gaze was lost in the panorama of the cityscape. The distant hum of traffic was a gentle counterpoint to the memory that played in my mind. He was thinking about Caleb's laughter, the intensity in his eyes, and the lingering warmth of his touch. He knew that this encounter, this unexpected spark, would stay with him, lighting the path ahead. Sandra was surprised by how easily Caleb, with his calm demeanor and quiet confidence, had affected her. There was something about the way he carried himself, unassuming and humble, yet with an undercurrent of strength that felt both grounding and magnetic. She had always been drawn to people who worked with their hands, people who could create or fix things with an effortless grace, as though the world bent to their will. I've always been drawn to people who work with their hands, people who can create or fix things with an effortless grace, as though the world bends to their will. Caleb is one of those people. It had been days since he'd left, but his presence still lingered in the house. I could replay the moment vividly. The flickering bulb above my head had been the perfect excuse to call for help, and Caleb had arrived promptly, his tool belt slung. Caleb was drawn to people who worked with their hands, people who could create or fix things with an effortless grace, as though the world bent to their will. He was one of those people. Though it had been days since he'd left, his presence still lingered in the house. She could replay the moment in vivid detail. The flickering bulb above her head had been the perfect excuse to call for help, and Caleb had arrived promptly, his tool belt slung casually around his waist. His hands moved with precision, every motion purposeful as he worked to solve the problem. But there had been something more in the air, a tension that built slowly and quietly like the rise of the tide. It wasn't the loud, fiery kind of chemistry. It was subtle, simmering just beneath the surface. He was at ease, but there was something more in the air. It was a tension that grew slowly and quietly like the rise of the tide. It wasn't the obvious kind of chemistry. It was more subtle, just below the surface. Sandra had said that evening that it was quiet and it was hard to ignore. She had a warm and genuine voice. She knew what she was doing. He remembered how Caleb had shifted slightly at her words, his movements pausing for a brief moment. Perhaps he was unsure of her tone, or maybe it was the way her gaze lingered. Sandra had said that evening that she knew what she was doing. She remembered how Caleb had shifted slightly at her words, his movements pausing for a brief moment. Perhaps he was unsure of her tone, or maybe it was the way her gaze lingered on him just a little too long. She hadn't been ready to let the moment slip away. She hadn't wanted him to leave and take that connection with him. There was something about him that drew her in, something that made her want to keep talking, to find a reason to stay close. She'd seen the surprise in his eyes as her words. He looked surprised, but then he looked curious, like he was interested in what she was saying. He thanked her, and his eyes met hers for a second before he looked back at the wires. Sandra felt her stomach flutter with a mix of excitement and nervousness that she hadn't felt before. He landed, and his reaction was subtle. He quickly replaced it with a faint curiosity that seemed to spark something deeper. "Thanks," he replied softly. His eyes briefly met hers before he turned his focus back to the wires. Sandra felt a flutter in her stomach. It was an unfamiliar mix of excitement and nervousness that she hadn't felt in a long time. The room seemed to shrink, and the air grew heavier as if the atmosphere itself conspired to pull them closer. She tried to keep the conversation going, hoping to stretch the moment a little longer. "I just think it's amazing how you can fix things so easily," she added, her voice light, but she felt like the room had gotten smaller and the air felt heavier, like the air itself was pulling them closer. He tried to keep talking, hoping to make the moment last a little longer. "I just think it's amazing how you can fix things so easily," she said. Her voice was light but sincere. "I've always admired people who can work with their hands." Caleb looked at her, then smiled shyly. He said, "It just takes practice." His voice was softer now, and the tension between them eased as her words seemed to soothe him as he continued to work. Sandra felt the weight in the room shift again, and she found herself wanting to know more about Caleb. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like he was more than just an electrician. There was a quiet depth to him, a story she hadn't yet uncovered, and Sandra wanted to know what lay beneath. Sandra was captivated by Caleb's quiet confidence, the way his hands moved with a steady assurance that hinted at a hidden depth. It was like an unspoken story hanging in the air, and she was determined to unravel it. "Need a hand?" she asked, her voice playful. Sandra was drawn to Caleb's quiet confidence. His hands moved with a steady assurance that hinted at a hidden depth. It was like an unspoken story hanging in the air, and she was determined to unravel it. She asked for his help, her voice playful, even though he clearly had everything under control. It was just a pretext, a way to linger in his presence and savor the moment a little longer. She adjusted her dress, letting the fabric slide provocatively off her shoulder. A surge of boldness coursed through her. It was a feeling both exhilarating and unfamiliar. Leaving her, she was breathing hard, but she felt emboldened to take a chance and step outside her comfort zone. She noticed Caleb looking at her and his eyes widening in surprise. He quickly looked away and focused on the intricate. Sandra noticed that Caleb was a bit nervous, but she also saw that he was strong and confident. She decided to take a chance and get to know him better. When he looked at her, she blushed a little. She tried to focus on the wiring, but she was also happy that she had made him nervous. She moved closer to him and asked about his work. But she was mostly focused on him. She noticed that his arm was tense and that his jaw was clenched. Sandra knew she had unsettled him, even if just a little. It was a small victory and a spark of connection. She moved closer and showed interest in the technicalities of his work, but her focus was entirely on him. She noticed the subtle tension in his arm as her hand brushed against his, and the way his jaw clenched. The air between them crackled with unspoken desire, a silent question hanging heavy in the space. As Caleb finished his work, he straightened up and began collecting his tools with an air of efficiency that brought a smile to Sandra's lips. But before he could make his escape, she took a deep breath, leaned in close and whispered, "Is there anything else I could ask you to fix?" Her voice was like silk, inviting with a hint of mischief. She hoped he wouldn't resist. His eyes widened again and she saw surprise flicker, but then something deeper took over and she felt a thrill. She reached out her fingers and touched his arm, then leaned in and kissed his cheek. The moment was electric and there was a palpable connection between them. Caleb was shocked and he stood there for a moment as if time had stopped. She reached out her fingers, grazing his arm, and leaned in to give him a soft kiss on the cheek. The moment was electric, and the air was filled with a palpable connection that they couldn't deny. Caleb was frozen with shock and time seemed to hang suspended as a kaleidoscope of emotions. Surprise, delight, confusion played across his face. Sandra held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, anticipating his response. The air crackled with possibility, but then he stepped back and his voice was a hesitant stammer. "Ma'am, I'm just here to fix the lights." Sandra chuckled softly, trying to defuse the situation. Sandra could see that he was surprised, delighted, and confused. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, anticipating his response. The air crackled with possibility, but then he stepped back. His voice was a hesitant stammer. "Ma'am, I'm just here to fix the lights." Sandra chuckled softly, trying to defuse the tension. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs attention?" she teased, closing the distance between them once more. Caleb, however, was flustered. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered his tools, his gaze averted. Sandra watched him go, a thrill coursing through her. He may have said no, but his reaction spoke volumes. Sandra realized the game had just begun. It hadn't been because he wasn't interested. She was certain of that. She had seen it in Caleb's eyes. He was holding back, trying to do the right thing, even as the tension between them simmered. Days passed, but Sandra couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time Sandra realized the game had just begun. It hadn't been because he wasn't interested. She was certain of that. She had seen it in Caleb's eyes. He was holding back, trying to do the right thing, even as the tension between them simmered. Days passed, but Sandra couldn't stop thinking about him every time she turned on the now perfect light. She remembered the way his arm had tensed when she touched it, the faint flush in his cheeks when she leaned in just a little too close. It had been exciting, exhilarating even. Sandra hadn't felt that way in a long time. She replayed the moment in her mind again and again, wondering. She remembered the way his arm had tensed when she touched it, the faint flush on his cheeks when she leaned in a little too close. It had been exciting, exhilarating even. Sandra hadn't felt that way in a long time. She replayed the moment in her mind, wondering what might have happened if she had pushed just a little further. A week later, her phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but she answered anyway. The sound of Caleb's voice on the other end of the line sent a flutter through her chest. "Hello," he said. "This is Caleb, the electrician." His tone was polite but with a slight. What if she had pushed a little harder a week later? Her phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but she answered anyway. The sound of Caleb's voice on the other end of the line sent a flutter through her chest. "Hello, this is Caleb, the electrician," he said. His tone was polite, but there was a slight tremble in his voice. "I just wanted to check if the lights are working properly." Sandra smiled warmly when she heard his voice. "Caleb, it's so nice of you to call." "The lights are fine," she replied. Her voice was soft with just a hint of something more. "But there's something else in the bathroom that needs fixing." Could you come take a look at the bathroom? There's something else that needs fixing. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Sandra wondered if he might say no, but then Caleb cleared his throat. His voice was steady now as he replied, "Of course I'll be there in the morning." Sandra hung up the phone and a slow smile spread across her face. Sandra could tell that there was something going on between them. It had started with a flickering light bulb and grown into a quiet spark that evening while she was getting ready for the next day. Now, as she hung up the phone, she couldn't help but wonder what else might be waiting to be fixed the next day. A gloomy afternoon cast the house in muted tones, weak. There was something undeniable in the air between them. It started with a flickering light bulb and grew into a quiet spark that evening as Sandra got ready for the next day. She wondered what else might be waiting to be fixed. A gloomy afternoon cast the house in muted tones. Sunlight filtered through the misty windows, bathing the living room in a dull gray glow. The quiet was heavy, the kind of silence that seemed to amplify every creak of the floorboards and every ticking second of the clock. Sandra sat in her favorite chair, the dark brown leather cool beneath her fingertips, waiting. The sun was coming through the windows, making the living room all gray. It was quiet and it felt like you could hear every noise, like the floorboards and the clock. Sandra was sitting in her favorite chair, which was dark brown and felt cool. She was waiting for something to happen, but it didn't. OVD was all around her. She looked at the clock. Every second felt like it took forever. Her heart was beating faster every time she thought about Caleb. He was the one who was always on her mind, and she wasn't used to that. The tension from their last meeting was still there, and Sandra couldn't stop thinking about Caleb. She glanced at the clock and every second felt like forever. Her heart was beating faster every time she thought about Caleb. He'd taken over her thoughts in a way she hadn't expected. Then the doorbell rang and it jolted her out of her thoughts. She stood up, smoothing her dress, and went to the door. When she opened it, she found Caleb standing there. His eyes were sharp and attentive. For a moment they just looked at each other. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Caleb tried to hide his feelings, but it was hard. The doorbell finally rang and it startled her out of her chaotic thoughts. She stood, smoothing her dress as she moved toward the door. She found Caleb standing there, his eyes sharp and attentive. For a moment they simply looked at each other. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Caleb tried to mask his inner turmoil with his usual confident demeanor, but there was a flicker of hesitation deep in his eyes. His grip on the tool bag was tight, and his knuckles whitened slightly as if the weight of it could steady his shaking hand. Sandra met him with a gentle smile and led him into the house. Caleb was still nervous, even though he was trying to act like he was always cool. Sandra gave him a little smile and pointed to the bathroom. He nodded and went in, sitting on the floor to check the handle like he had before. But he wasn't really paying attention to the job. He felt like she was watching him and he could almost feel her presence. "Hey, I'm still here," she said, nodding toward the bathroom. Caleb nodded and went inside, kneeling down to check the handle like he had before. His hands moved methodically, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him, her presence felt even in her silence. Like a gentle but unrelenting breeze brushing against his skin, Sandra finally broke the quiet. "Hey Caleb," she said softly. Her tone carried more weight than her words. "I've been thinking a lot about you." He paused, gripping the loose handle a little tighter as if the motion could ground him. "Really?" Sandra finally spoke up, her voice low and unsure. "I've been thinking a lot about you." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and her breath was warm against the still air. "I can't stop thinking about last time. You seemed interested, but then you pulled away." Caleb didn't answer immediately. His hand trembled slightly. He didn't answer right away. His hand was shaking a little because he was trying not to think about her. "I'm a professional," he said at last. His voice was still shaking, but he was trying to be strong. "This isn't right, Sandra. I'm a grown man. I know there's something between us. You can feel it, can't you?" He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. He finished securing the handle and put his tools down. "Who decides what's right or wrong?" Sandra asked gently. "You're a grown man, Caleb. I'm a grown woman. We both know there's something between us. You can feel it, can't you?" Caleb took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. He finished securing the handle and set his tools aside. "And who gets to decide what's right or wrong?" she asked, her tone a mix of challenge and curiosity. You're a grown man, Caleb. I'm a grown woman. We both know there's something between us, right? Can't you feel it? Caleb took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. He finished securing the handle, set his tools aside and stood up, turning to face her. His eyes showed a mix of professionalism and emotions. He tried hard to keep them in check, but they had been building since they first met. Sandra stepped closer, her hand pressing softly against his chest. She could feel his heart pounding beneath her palm. Its rhythm betrayed the restraint he was struggling to keep up. The tension between them was electric, radiating in waves as the moment hung precariously in the balance. This isn't a game, Caleb, he murmured. He was barely above a growl as he leaned closer, and it was clear he was about to give in. I never said it was Sandra, he whispered back, her lips curving into a soft smile. But there's no need to overcomplicate this. For a moment, Caleb hesitated, then he broke the silence. He closed the distance between them and pulled her toward him. His lips met hers in a deep, passionate kiss, releasing all the emotions he had kept bottled up for so long. Sandra responded eagerly, her arms wrapping around his neck and pulling him closer. They were so close that they could barely breathe. The rest of the afternoon was a total whirlwind of emotions. The tension that had been building since they first met finally reached a boiling point. It wasn't just the shower handle or the flickering light that was fixed. It was the release of something far more powerful that had been building up beneath the surface. Caleb finally let go of his hesitation and let himself be guided by the feelings he'd been trying so hard to suppress now overwhelmed him. His hands, usually so steady and precise in their technical work, trembled with a different kind of energy as they traced every curve of Sandra's body with undisguised eagerness. Time seemed to dissolve around them, leaving only the shared intensity of the moment as they surrendered to the connection they'd been building since the day they met. The air crackled with anticipation as Sandra led Caleb from the bathroom to the bedroom. Their movements were deliberate and slow, a silent choreography. They were on the same page. Every glance, every brush of skin against skin, said a lot in the charged atmosphere. Caleb's eyes, a mix of longing and uncertainty, searched Sandra's face, seeking reassurance. He needed to know that this transgression, this delicious surrender to forbidden desires, felt as right to her as it did to him. Sandra, sensing his hesitation, placed a reassuring hand on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart, mirroring her own. He captured her wrist, his touch both gentle and insistent. They drew each other closer until their lips met once more. This kiss felt different, like it was charged with raw passion that had been building up for weeks. It was like a firestorm of longing, erasing all doubt and reservations. The world outside their embrace seemed to melt away, leaving only the two of them caught in a whirlwind of forbidden attraction. Caleb's touch was cautious at first, but he soon grew bolder, driven by a primal urge that shattered the fragile boundaries they had erected. Each kiss, each caress, chipped away at the wall that had separated them until it crumbled completely. Time stopped as they gave in to the undeniable force that had drawn them together from the moment they met. Afterwards, they lay entwined in the soft afternoon light filtering through the curtains. No explanations were needed, no apologies offered. Society's expectations of right and wrong faded into insignificance, replaced by the raw, unfiltered emotions that bound them together in a symphony of shared passion. The world outside, the wall that separated them, had fallen down, and time stopped as they were drawn together. From the moment they met, they were attracted to each other. In the afternoon light, they lay together. They didn't need to explain or apologize. Society's ideas about right and wrong didn't matter anymore. They were just enjoying each other's company. The world outside seemed far away and not important. The golden light made them feel warm and safe, and they just wanted to enjoy the moment. Caleb's hand was on Sandra's waist, showing how close they were. Their breathing was in sync and their bodies were close, showing how intimate they were. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, showing that they understood each other without saying anything. They'd crossed a line and ventured into forbidden territory, but neither had any regrets. It felt like it was meant to be, like their unspoken desires had finally come to fruition. As the sun started setting and casting long shadows across the room, the fragile bubble of their passion started to burst. Reality, with all its harsh truths and unavoidable consequences, crept back in, and their blissful moment was over. Caleb stirred, propping himself up on one elbow to gaze at Sandra. His expression was now clouded with a renewed sense of gravity. The fun and games had stopped. He was serious now. Sandra started, her voice quiet. "I'm not sure if this was the right thing to do." She smiled a little and touched his cheek. She was trying to calm him down. "Why not, Caleb?" she said, her voice soft. "It feels right, doesn't it?" He looked at the ceiling, thinking. Then they were both quiet. Caleb finally broke the silence, and I could tell he was nervous. He said quietly, "I'm just your electrician." I chuckled and he relaxed a bit. I said, "Caleb, you're more than just an electrician to me." He sat up and ran a hand through his short hair. His uncertainty was clear in the way his eyes flickered with doubt. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. "This is unprofessional. It's not right." I could see the worry on his face, just like I had felt when he'd first come to my house. Caleb always seemed to be fighting with what he thought was right and what he really wanted. I sat up next to him and put my hand on his shoulder, hoping to help him feel better. "We're both adults, Caleb," I said gently. "What happened between us doesn't have to be so complicated. We both wanted this and we're both happy about it, so there's no need to overthink it." He turned to me then. His dark eyes met mine as if he was trying to untangle the mess of thoughts in his head. After a moment he asked, "What should we do next?" I shrugged, leaned in and kissed him lightly on the lips. I hoped to quiet the storm in his heart. "Now you go back to work," I said playfully. "Maybe we'll meet again." Caleb chuckled, shaking his head. "You make it sound so simple." His voice was laced with a mix of amusement and disbelief. For a moment his gaze lingered on mine. "Now you go back to work and maybe we'll meet again," I said playfully. "You make it sound so simple." Caleb chuckled, shaking his head. A flicker of relief in his eyes. "You're making it sound easy," he said. His voice had a mix of amusement and disbelief. For a moment his gaze lingered on my face. His expression softened as if he were accepting something he hadn't fully understood before. Finally he nodded, standing and gathering his tools. "We'll see," he said. His tone was uncertain but tinged with a quiet hope. With one last look he walked out of the house, leaving me standing there. I felt a swirl of emotions. Hope, excitement, and an undeniable curiosity about where this unexpected connection might lead. As the door clicked shut behind him, I found myself smiling. Maybe it wasn't as simple as I had made it. It was simple, but sometimes the most complex journeys start with the simplest moments. Outside, the sunlight was fading and giving way to the soft glow of twilight. The shadows of the neighborhood deepened and Caleb's footsteps grew faint. Like a whisper carried away on the evening breeze, I moved to the window and watched as his figure disappeared down the street. Instead of feeling regret or worry, my heart softened. This moment felt like a turning point I hadn't anticipated on an otherwise ordinary day when Caleb came to fix my flickering light. I never thought my life would change so much in just a few hours, but that's how it goes with change. It often comes when you're not ready for it, and it brings the unexpected and the extraordinary. That afternoon wasn't just the end of an electrical repair. It was the start of something new. A connection. A journey. We didn't know where it was going, but maybe the real miracle wasn't in knowing where we were headed, but in taking that first step, doubts and all.